Good morning and welcome to the 29th meeting of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee in 2025. Before we begin, can I ask everyone to ensure that their electronic devices are switched to silent? Our first item on the agenda is consideration of the Crofting and Scottish Land Court Bill at Stage 1. And at today's meeting, we're going to take evidence from representatives of the Crofting community. And I'll invite you all to introduce yourself in just a moment. We've allocated around 2 hours for the discussion, and as we have quite a few participants, can I ask everyone to be succinct in their questions and answers. If you could just indicate to me or one of the clerks if you wish to participate at any point, but please understand there's no expectation for you to speak on every question, particularly if you feel that the point has already been made or that the discussion doesn't relate directly to your area of expertise. And also, you don't need to operate your microphones. We have an operator, I'm just thinking of the name, a microphone operator, the lady at the end of the table here who will do that for you. So we'll kick off in a clockwise direction. If I can ask Jackie to introduce herself. Thank you.
For the invitation to be here. I'm Jackie McCreary from Scottish Land and Estates, so we represent the interests of landowners, landlords in crofting areas.
Thank you.
I'm James McKessick-Leach, Policy and Practice Lead at the Scottish Land Commission, non-departmental public body advising Parliament and Government on land reform matters. Thank you.
Hi, Rhiannon Montgomery, NFU Scotland. Thanks for the opportunity for us to give evidence today. We represent both farmers and crofters, and I look after our dedicated Crofting Highlands Islands Committee.
Thank you.
Many thanks for the invitation to speak. My name is Josh Doble. I'm here on behalf of Community Land Scotland, which is the representative body for Scotland's community landowners, which is a movement of people taking control of land, buildings and assets to shape their own futures. We have about 140 members all around Scotland, which includes community landowners of major crofting estates and also smaller assets in inner city areas. Many of our members and many of our founding members in 2010 were crofting community landowners, and there's a particularly close relationship between crofting and community land ownership.
Thank you. Sandra.
Good morning, I'm Sandra Holmes. I'm with Highlands and Islands Enterprise. We are Scottish Government's economic and community development agency for an area extending to just half of Scotland. It coincides with the crofting counties. And in a personal capacity, I should perhaps declare that I'm a crofting tenant and a member of the Scottish Crofting Federation.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks very much for the engagement with the committee on this topic. I'm Donna Smith. I'm Chief Exec at the Scottish Crofting Federation, who's a membership organisation representing crofters and crofting.
Thank you very much. Josh.
To declare, I'm also a member of the Scottish Crofting Federation.
Okay, thank you. And you're most welcome. Thank you for giving your time this morning to help us in our deliberations. We've got 5 themes, but we think there's probably about half an hour per theme. So we're going to kick off with environmental use of crofts. What I would like is to hear your views on Section 1, which revises the duty on crofters, which will allow a third and distinct option for croft land, which is environmental use. And during the evidence we've heard already, there was calls by some for greater clarity around how environmental be used and how environmental use will be defined. So we're looking for your views on that. Who would like to kick off? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so we are concerned about the vague use of environmental use within this bill. We do support crofters contributing positively to biodiversity, carbon sequestration and landscape health, but they must do so while remaining productive. We would like to see more acknowledgement of active land management by possibly rewording the bill to read active management for environmental use. Our members are concerned that without this clear definition relating to active land management, that there may be a risk that land be abandoned under the guise of environmental purposes.
Thank you. Now, I must apologise. I've got a screen right in front of me, and it shouldn't have been difficult to remember, but we do have Anne Murray, who is the Chief Officer from the Economic and Community Regeneration. Anne, would you like to introduce yourself? And my apologies for missing you out.
Good morning.
Oh, yeah, you're just muted. That's you. Go ahead.
Hi, good morning. I'm Anne Murray, Chief Officer for Economic and Community Regeneration at the Cordon and Shire. So obviously we're the local authority for the Western Isle.
Great, thank you very much. And again, apologies for missing you out to introduce yourself. Donna.
Yeah, I think I suspect quite a few of us are broadly on the same page with this one. We have no issue with the inclusion of that purpose, other than it needs to be stronger than it is. I'm sure everyone's aware that the biggest issue, one of the biggest issues you see when you travel around the crofting counties is neglect of crofts. We cannot allow this inclusion to be an excuse or a valid reason for people to say, well, I'm rewilding my croft, I'm doing nothing. So whilst we appreciate in the bill, as drafted, it says planned and managed, we think that could be stronger to make it absolutely clear that it has to be, with some sort of intentional design and written down objectives or outcomes that you're trying to achieve in order to make that clear. Now, that raises all sorts of issues around who then reviews that and checks that that's happening. But I think if we're going to introduce that, that absolutely has to be much stronger than it is. Because we see it all over the place, and you can see how easy it would be for somebody to say, I'm rewilding. So, yeah.
So at the moment, do you have any examples of that being the case? And how does the Crofting Commission deal with abandoned crofts where people are suggesting that it's still being used for environmental purposes?
Well, it's an interesting question. So we are aware of cases. I'm certainly aware of one on Skye, which we recently visited, where that is the claim by the tenant. But it also brings in a residency question, and I think all of this is kind of combined together. So that individual claims that they are ordinarily resident when they've been on the croft a handful of days in several years, and claims that they have a plan to rewild the croft for biodiversity purposes. But how can you do any of that if you're not on the ground and actually managing it actively and all the rest of it? So I think there's absolutely cases out there of where people are trying to get away with this. How the Commission manages that, I think, well, I can't speak for the Commission, but I think broadly, certainly whenever we're out and about speaking to our members, the loud message you get is that everybody would like the Commission to regulate much more on both residency and neglect, because they don't see enough of it happening at the moment. So
currently, as the legislation sits at the moment, do you think the powers are strong enough or the definitions are clear enough? You think that would need to be amended at stage 2?
I think, well, so the powers are there. So there is a breach of duties process, and I know we'll get onto that later. But so that power is there. I think some of the definitions potentially need tightening up. I think we would particularly like to see the ordinarily resident definition tightened up. I know at the moment it's sort of left as a case of policy. And in fact, I know that the Commission are discussing the residency policy at their board meeting, probably right now as we speak. But I think if we're to absolutely be clear on this in the future, we would sort of welcome consideration of whether something could be included, whether it's in primary or secondary legislation that clarifies that definition. There is existing case law around tax, but I guess the principles are the same, that did sort of fairly well describe what a definition might be. So we would certainly welcome some thought about whether something along those lines could be considered to, just make it absolutely clear for the future.
Okay. Jackie.
Yeah, I think in terms of environmental use of the croft itself, obviously landlords' consent isn't required, and that's as it should be. But I think the only point I would probably make is that the one restriction is that it shouldn't, the environmental purpose shouldn't adversely affect use of adjacent land. And I don't know whether Joyce will agree with me or not, but I think we probably could do with a wider protection than that, in that it wouldn't adversely affect other crofters and the landowners' interests, because, what happens on a single croft, as Donna said, could impact on those around them. I do think it's slightly odd that the environmental use is really just a heading. There's no actually requirement for positive environmental benefit, both here and in relation to common grazing. So I think that would be a benefit to actually have some positive environmental benefit, or at least at the moment it seems not to do any harm. But I would say, I know that those of us that are on the stakeholder group with ScotGov, this has already been talked about, and I think the officials have taken on board some of the concerns that have been raised. So hopefully that will come forward at stage 2 to be changed.
Okay, thank you. Josh.
Yeah, thanks. So I'd agree with a lot of what's been said already, but I'll just maybe add a couple of points. So important to say that in principle, we are very welcoming of the inclusion of environmental use of crofts. I think that's a positive development. Notwithstanding, there is this issue around definition, and there are some risks in terms of maybe not tightening up that definition, and those risks are some of the points that have been covered. So encouraging absenteeism, could see a rise in speculation. There is definitely a potential impact on neighbouring crofts that would have to be considered. And something which hasn't been discussed yet is the potential future cultivation of the land being prevented, so making sure that kind of its use for agricultural purposes won't be detrimental into the future. We do have some kind of suggested wording around what environmental use could be, something along the lines of any form of use which is intentionally designed and systematically managed to deliver environmental outcomes. And as Donna was saying, so I think this nuance needs to be discussed now, and like where it sits in the bill, whether there's something on the face of the bill, whether there's something in regulation afterwards, is probably an active point of discussion for the committee. But I think there could be a benefit in tightening up the wording in a way that doesn't create bureaucratic issues down the line.
Okay. Sandra?
We also support inclusion of environmental use as a legitimate form of land use. It's really important that crofting legislation remains responsive to the evolving environmental and land management sort of priorities. Agree with other witnesses that we don't feel that the current definition, this isn't really a definition, doesn't go far enough. We would like to see sort of proactive, nature-positive outcomes to actually deliver something beneficial. For example, planned and managed could equate to planting Sitka spruce on peatland, which is planned and managed, but we now know is ecologically damaging. So we'd like it to go further than currently stated.
Okay, thank you. Ariane Burgess.
Thanks, Convener. Josh, I just wanted to come back on the points you were making around the wording of environmental use, and actually what people have said in general. And I wonder, and you may not be across this, but we've got the Natural Environment Bill going through Parliament at the moment, and I just wonder if you've thought about the connection between what might need to be said in the crofting bill and what's happening in the Natural Environment Bill.
I'm probably not across that enough to give a proper answer. I suppose if there are, as we've seen with community right to buy, and as we will probably discuss at some point, crofting community right to buy, land reform, getting legislation as joined up as possible makes a lot of sense. So if there are aspects of the Natural Environment Bill that would have an impact upon the environmental use of crofts, and there's a way of future-proofing what environmental use on crofts might look like and any stipulations that might be within the Natural Environment Bill, it would make good sense, considering that's what stage 1 debate and this is stage 1 scrutiny, to make sure those two bits of legislation speak to each other.
Rhoda. Oh, beg your pardon, James.
I would largely agree with what's been said so far. I think just a couple of extra kind of notes of caution. So one just around in terms of over-defining environmental use. I think there's also a parallel in the Land Reform Bill at the moment. So beginning of part 2, there is a new model lease that will be developed as part of that, again, with an environmental focus. And I think just as kind of Sandra was saying a minute ago, we now know that things like tree planting on peat are bad. And I think having that flexibility into the future, perhaps as Josh noted, options to bring land back into cultivation, perhaps through agroforestry or techniques that haven't quite been developed yet. So just a caution around overdevelopment of that. And again, just to build on the links element, as I said, there's a new model lease, hopefully as part of the Land Reform Bill that's going through Parliament at the moment. So just again, making that link to a different form of tenure in a slightly different sector as well.
I've got Anne, please.
Thank you. Sorry for slight delay in unmuting. I'll try not to repeat what anybody else has said, but yes, in our response and the views that have been passed on to me, there are some concerns in terms of the definition of environmental use and some risks really that it might be an easy option in terms of how people are putting their crops to purposeful use. I suppose the other thing is just the need to strike the right balance. It's important that crofting is still used crofts are used for livestock as well. And, you know, just I think crofters are concerned on the direction of travel and the right balance being struck so that the utilisation of crofts for livestock is still being promoted and supported, whereas at the moment it can be quite challenging.
Thank you. Rhoda.
I just wonder, because crofting is really there for agricultural use and kind of sustainability, and we heard, I think, from a group of crofters and smallholders some time ago that lots of them were already net zero and indeed sequestrating carbon. So I wonder, should the environmental use be linked to agricultural use so that you can't just say I'm rewilding it and walk away, that you need to maybe have agricultural production but that is environmentally friendly? Would that be a different way of looking at it? Or, you know, is there something we're missing about how we could protect nature through crofting?
I think, Rhoda, so there is something here about making sure that that land use, whatever it is integrated in some way. So, for instance, what I was going to flag up was an example of where we're aware of a crofter in Skye who, you know, worked hard to take on a croft in the first place, but the croft that they've managed to secure with the funds that they had available to them is one that was previously just planted up with trees with no real plan or anything else. That plantation failed, but what the crofter has inherited then is a croft where the agricultural land, in theory, is covered in mounds from where all these failed trees were planted, and they're now going to have to do an enormous amount of work to try and bring that back into, you know, cultivation use. So, for agriculture, you know, so there is something about making sure, and that I guess comes from the planned and managed, you know, that you're not just saying, well, I'm just going to blanket this and that's it. It's got to be considered and it's got to be thought out in terms of how there's a balance there of land uses, so that you're not, destroying the land for the sort of future use of others that come along behind you.
I've got Rihanna and then Josh.
Just to agree with Donna's point there, I think that integrated land use is really important in this, and I think that, you know, crofters want to be able to support environmental targets while still carrying out agricultural activities. So I think that kind of having wording that allows them to still do that whilst, like you say, not having kind of blanket things happening, I think is really important.
I think it's a very good question, Rhoda, and I suppose it brings to mind a couple of thoughts. And I guess, so as Donna was saying, getting the wording right, having something that around like intentionally designed and systematically managed, so it's not a case of abandonment. I think the point that was raised earlier about being ordinarily resident, I think is really important as well. So you've got a model of, even if a croft is being used almost exclusively for environmental purposes, the person who is responsible for that is within the crofting township, is kind of part of the wider community and is integrated into township life. Because I think it's, hopefully we'll touch on this in some later themes, but kind of making sure that whoever is managing that croft is embedded into the wider township and part of contributing to that wider kind of culture, I think is incredibly important. But I also agree with the point that you were driving, I also agree with the point that you were driving at around crofting as a potentially very low impact form of agriculture that should be supported. So we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that it is a socially resilient and potentially environmentally resilient way of creating food that should be supported. So I completely agree with the sentiment of not losing sight of the fact that crofting is primarily about agriculture. But as James was saying earlier, I'd be wary of tying a definition that's too tight that limits what could be a very beneficial land use for a particular township in some circumstances, so not to create kind of straitjacket too much.
Thank you. Jackie.
Yeah, just to support what Josh has said, I think the direction of travel for crofting, I guess, over the last decade or so has been to allow wider activity, so purposeful use. And I know that some of the legal commentators a couple of weeks ago had said that probably environmental use could fit within purposeful use anyway, but maybe it's good to have a direction of travel on the face of the bill that environmental benefit is being encouraged. But I do think it's the direction of travel we're going with agricultural holdings as well, in terms of facilitating sustainable regenerative agriculture and that kind of thing, but perhaps something along the lines of not inconsistent with future cultivation or something along those lines could maybe tie the thing together so that, because at the moment we don't have a food security crisis, but we could in future, and it could be public policy would turn right back round to production, and it could be we want to encourage the use of the land again for production, whereas at the moment I think the policy driver is to allow wider use.
Just more generally, it's quite clear, I was someone who didn't know very much about crofting or how different it is just from agricultural policy. There's a whole set of different outcomes that are desired, and I think Andrew Thinn in one of our previous sessions suggested this could be the key to addressing rural depopulation or island depopulation in particular. How can we be sure that something like adding an environmental use clause doesn't detract from the overall outcomes that crofting is supposed to deliver? You know, Josh touched on the importance of townships. How might townships be weakened by including this environmental use clause, if you like, or policy? Is there enough safeguards and enough prioritisation that we still achieve the outcome that crofting legislation is supposed to achieve? Josh?
Yeah, I can definitely respond to that. So I think, to be honest, it picks up on some of the points that we've been making before about safeguarding some of the potential risks. So there is a risk if environmental use is included and is kind of a woolly definition and it isn't closely tied to being ordinarily resident, and then you could see speculation on crofts. You could see, you know, natural capital market drivers coming to play on crofting land more than it already is because it's seen as being potentially very profitable. You've got people owning crofts who don't live near them because they're seeing it as an opportunity to plant trees for timber production or for carbon credits. So there are absolutely risks in there, which is why it's really important, I think, to tighten up the definition a little, have some secondary legislation or regulation that sets that out more closely, have it very closely linked to ordinarily resident and proper evidence for ordinarily resident, which we'll come on to later, so that it can become part of an integrated crofting system which is kind of fit for the 21st century, which will include some environmental measures and may reference agroecology or regenerative agriculture on crofts, but that kind of integrates it into the system rather than being an add-on that could inadvertently end up to kind of extraction from crofting.
Yeah, thank you. Jackie?
I think I was just going to add, crofting on its own won't repopulate areas. I think, there, you know, as Josh said, it's one part of a bigger thing. We need employment for a start, and I think that's where one of our worries about the bill is the landowner, the estate's role is being diminished, and I think that's a place where there could be a role for the estate in providing off-croft employment and other encouraging other forms of off-croft employment, because essentially it's not usually a full-time employment. Is not. There's always another form of income needed. So those wider issues need to be addressed as well as encouraging people into crofting.
Thank you. Rihanna, then James.
Yeah, I think I would agree with Jackie. I think there are opportunities for kind of tackling that island and rural depopulation. I would agree with Josh as well in terms of the natural capital thing. We don't want to see, you know, large areas of land having whole-scale land use change, and I think that integrated aspect is really important. And yeah, I think, like I say, there are opportunities there, but I think if we tie it to kind of the residency duty and things like that, there are ways around where we can sort this.
Thank you. James.
Thanks. I think there's possibly also a broader question here about land use planning. So we've had obviously kind of questions of what if one crofter goes down a very particular environmental type use next door to someone else. And of course, there are plenty of crofts in the Highlands that are not next to other crofts at all, other kind of landowners with different tenure arrangements or owner-occupiers. So there's perhaps a question there to think about. It's not just the crofting system as a whole, but actually land use planning at a more regional or local level, bringing those decisions together, decision makers together to come up with a plan, not perhaps too dissimilar to the regional land use partnership pilots that are ongoing at the moment, so that rather than every kind of individual crofter, farmer or landowner doing their own thing, following their own particular path, it's a bit more joined up, and so the sum of the whole is greater than its parts.
Okay, thank you. Sandra.
Our sort of real interest in crofting is about population. We see that crofting really helps to root communities in our more rural areas. And I suppose many of the benefits of this bill is that it should sort of streamline and simplify crofting and hopefully free up the Commission's time to really focus on the regulation, which I know they're doing a lot of work on in terms of residency use. And going back to the original point, in terms of environmental use, it might feel it's a bit more passive, and if you haven't got animals, you don't have to be there twice a day or whatever else. So I think it is looking at this in the round. And, you know, crofting works really, really well when it is well supported and well regulated, and that is absolutely critical to helping to keep our communities thriving. And in the Highlands and Islands at the moment, we're on the cusp of huge opportunities, and a big constraint on economic and community development across our region is lack of housing. And I'm not saying that crofting equates completely to housing, but there is a correlation there. But what we want is, there's lots of houses in the Highlands and Islands that aren't lived in, and it's having more people living in Highlands and Islands housing year-round, and a robust crofting system will certainly strengthen that position.
Thank you. Donna?
I would just sum up by saying, yeah, it needs safeguards so that and it's all been touched on, but it's not encouraging absenteeism, it's not encouraging land speculation on crofts, and that the environmental uses don't prevent future cultivation. And I think if we can safeguard those and keep the people there, then we'll be good.
Thank you. We're going to move on to our next theme, which is quite tidily on to the enforcement of crofters' duties. And I get questions from Alistair Allen.
Thank you, Convener. It'd be interesting just to kick off a wider conversation, I suppose, about enforcement, since it's been touched on already and has been a continual theme in our visits as well. Just about the bill as drafted and what people feel it does to promote good enforcement around crofters' duties. And some of them have been mentioned already, but you know, we can pick out breaches of duties. We could talk about some of the issues that there are when it comes to people not meeting the residence requirement or other things. But I'd be interested just, you know, to focus in a bit on how people feel the bill as it's put before us helps address some of that stuff.
Kick off. Donna. Donna keeps catching my eye.
Well, where to start? So I think so. There is one positive change in this drafted bill, which is that the breach of duties process is being streamlined slightly, and I think that's crucial. So just for those that maybe don't fully understand, that the breach of duties process at the minute is a very long and complicated one, and rightly so, because obviously you are potentially, you know, removing people from crofts at the end of it. But about the first 6 months or so at the minute is spent trying to establish if somebody is in breach of duty before you then go on to look at what they might do to resolve that. Now, there are people every year who voluntarily admit through their annual notice and things like that that they're not resident and they're not cultivating and maintaining the croft or whatever. So the change that's coming forward will allow the Commission in those cases, as if I understand is correct, to accept, right, they're in breach, and then you start from that point of the process rather than the start. So that's definitely a welcome change. The rest of it probably comes down to policy then in terms of how you handle that. I think at the moment folk have many opportunities to kind of temporarily fix their breach of duties rather than permanently fix their breach of duties, and whether that could be tightened up so it's a bit harder, I don't know. That's just all that sort of stuff. But that's probably policy rather than legislative. I think the other big thing around breach of duties, though, that we keep coming back to is when somebody, you know, who can report a breach of duty that the Commission then has to take action on, because again, the way that the legislation is written, the Commission only has to investigate in certain circumstances, and there has been a slight broadening of the definition around crofting community and who can report breaches, but I think our feeling is it's probably still not wide enough, so there's still a huge swathe of people that might report a breach that the Commission could just choose to ignore. You know, and it's a difficult area, and the one thing you always hear when you speak to crofters is it's very difficult. So largely at the minute the onus is on neighbouring crofters in that township to report that, you know, the guy next door is in breach of his duties. That's very, very difficult for people, because ultimately, at the end of the day, you might report them, they will know who's reported them, and however the situation was resolved, that person might still be living next door to you. So in a small community, that's a very, very uncomfortable place to be. But how we help that is also tricky as well. So we've had lots of discussions with members and internally in our working groups about, well, could you should we be broadening the definition of Crofton community further? But I appreciate, and I mean, we've spoken to the Crofton policy team many times about this, it's difficult to put a geographic boundary or whatever, and you could look at parish or you could look at this, but all of that's quite difficult. So another option that we've been talking about is whether there could be other designated sort of bodies, official bodies, that would be able to report a breach and the Commission would have to investigate. That might be one thing to consider. So, for instance, could you have sort of established organisations? Because it's difficult. If you just open it up and say anybody can report and the Commission has to investigate, then obviously you might open up to sort of spurious allegations and stuff like that. But if you had something like maybe the ARPID, the ARPID inspectors are out on the ground, they might be out inspecting somebody, and if they happen to see that the croft next door is neglected, should they be able to report that and the Commission investigate the breach, or other established bodies like that? I don't know. That's certainly one discussion that we've been having a lot.
Okay. Open up. What's your views on the Crofton Commission's decision to increase resources for enforcement duties?
Well, I mean, that's very welcome. I think where we're at the minute, though, we're trying to recover from decades of not enough action being taken. So that's a big juggernaut to turn around. But no, we very much welcome the fact that the Commission are increasing their efforts on this. And I think, hopefully over time, if some momentum can be really gained on that, then it starts to really send a message out, because we've got a whole other topic around the market in Crofts, which I'm not getting to just now, but some real proper enforcement on duties might start to turn some of those around. So very, very welcome, but I think there's a long way to go, and it has to be consistent and it has to build as we go in order to make a real difference overall on the ground, I think.
Okay. So just if I can pick up on the point you made earlier on there, Donna, about reporting, I completely appreciate and agree with the point you make about the difficulties involved in this, but the bill does go some of the way to taking some of the pressure that was put on grazing committees specifically away, that was put there 15 years ago in the last legislation. Does it, or does it?
No, it does, because in the last legislation, yes, there was so in the same way that there was an annual notice for all crofters to complete, there was a sort of I can't remember exactly what the term of it was, but the Grazing Committee were supposed to do a report every 5 years, and that caused huge problems for all the reasons I said. That meant effectively you had people in the township having to send the Commission a report of who was and wasn't doing their thing, which immediately did cause huge fractions in some areas. So no, it's good that that's been taken away. It should be a choice. And if people want to report them, then they can. That option is there. But yeah, not forcing people into it is a good thing.
Okay. I've got Jackie, Rihanna and then Josh.
Yeah, I would just say that the landlord has been added to the list of those that can report. And our members, I would say, have had mixed feelings about that. Some feel that's a positive thing because the landlord could perhaps be seen as a neutral if there are opposing views, and that's positive if they want to take that role. Others are a bit worried that they don't want to get stuck in the middle of family disputes and that kind of thing. So that not all landlords will use that option, but I think it's a positive addition. I would agree with Donna. Maybe some, again, more neutral bodies maybe could be useful, and there could be parallels with the Land Reform Bill and the Land and Communities Commissioner. There's a similar system for reporting breaches and anonymised breach reports sometimes. So there's maybe some useful crossovers there.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, I think Jackie's kind of taken my point a little bit there. Yeah, I think finding a balance is really difficult with kind of strengthening the provisions and the Commission, but also, encouraging people to still feel confident to report those breaches. I think for us that, you know, in terms of who can report, I think the local thing and the kind of the community is still really important. We wouldn't want people that are well out with that community to be able to report. I think it's very much should be limited to kind of the township, or, you know, if you want to expand the Crofton community, I think we would be supportive of that. One of the things I did want to touch on in terms of the streamlining enforcement for crofters' duties, we do support that. However, I think removing any specified deadlines for decision making, we would not support. We think that's really important to keep those clear timescales.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. There's lots of agreement this morning. So I agree with Donna. I think the definition of Crofton community is too narrow. It creates, again, a bit of a straitjacket of who the Commission's actually going to listen to and act on. I think looking at the Land Reform Bill is very instructive in this, where it was decided that actually communities reporting breaches on landowners who they may have a conflicted relationship with doesn't necessarily work. And I think expecting crofters within the same township to report their neighbours is not realistic. So thinking through what an expanded definition of Crofton community might be, I think would be helpful. You know, we are broadly supportive of the use of parish rather than township as a way of looking at that. We would also support a more proactive role for other organisations, such as Rural Payment and Inspections Division and local community councils to be able to report breaches. We'd also be supportive of aspirant crofters, not just crofters, so those registered with the Land Matching Service who are in the local area to be able to report breaches as well, because they obviously have a clear interest in the system working. I absolutely welcome increased resource for the Commission. I think there's a broad consensus that the system's not working as well as it could, and that resource for the Commission and the Commission being empowered to be more interventionist when it's looking at enforcement of duties would be really welcome. And then, just as a kind of, well, as a point on landlords, I think Jackie's right. That's a kind of broadly welcomed that landlords can report, although that will be used kind of in conflicted power for them to have. You know, 25% of crofts are on community-owned land, so there's a lot of community landlords of crofting communities. And I think in egregious cases, reporting can be useful for a landlord, but I think remediation would probably be the first port of call. And just a kind of broader kind of policy intent behind this is that there is a public interest concern in crofting working well. And so there is a policy rationale for a proportionate yet wide range of stakeholders to be able to report breach of duties, because there is a wider public interest in this system working. So we shouldn't be afraid, as with the Land Reform Bill, of expanding who can report breaches, as long as we're not doing it, and I agree with Rihanna, about having something that is too broad and pulls it out with what could be reasonably considered to be a crofting community.
Okay, thank you. Ariane Burgess.
Clearly, reporting is a delicate situation, and Don, I take your example of a neighbour reporting somebody, and then if it doesn't, however it pans out, there's that kind of living with that conflict. And certainly representing the Highlands and Islands, there's a lot of really amazing things happening there, but I do also come across quite a bit of conflict among communities, and it is really heartbreaking that people are having to live in that kind of situation. So something I've been thinking about, and that maybe it's not in this bill, but I feel like we need something which is what I'm calling a soft infrastructure, where there is support and funding for people who, and maybe some of you know about the Common Ground Forum that's working really well in the deer management space, but something where we actually recognise that conflict does happen, it's potentially going to happen in this kind of setting, and be proactive and say, we recognise that we need to fund people who have the skills to manage that conflict, to help people move through it. Because you don't have, you might have a conflict, but you don't have to live with it forever. And what we see is when people come to the table and start talking to each other, that is what can help really move people through. And I just feel like we need something. And that's not necessarily for this bill, but I do feel like somebody used the word cliping at the last evidence session on this. And I just, we definitely, Josh, I love what you say, that it is in the public interest that crofting is working well. We maybe need to be helping people better than we are in the rural space. I just wonder what your thoughts are. And I mentioned you, Donna, but I'm not necessarily throwing it at you. But yeah.
Or Jackie, kick off.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, we're talking about a system where people want to be regulated. That's quite unusual. So, you know, there should be a solution that everybody's happy with. And I think it's that idea of depending on people reporting on each other is by definition going to be divisive. So having more neutral bodies, or at least those that have filters to filter out the vexatious reports, and to, you know, those kind of bodies. I think someone in their evidence had mentioned the local ARPID offices, or, you know, so if there's someone, an office that has a process for filtering out the vexatious reports, but can anonymise them and maybe, you know, filter in some way, that kind of system might work better. But as I say, people want to be regulated. That's what they see as the benefit of crofting. So.
Sandra, then Josh.
So we all want, you know, effective regulation, and reporting is a key element of that. I think a challenge is quite a lot of tensions within crofting, and currently those who can report, and also if you include those who are, it's being proposed, can additionally report if the bill goes through. It's still quite a closed group, and it's still very much, it's like a community of interest that's operating within the wider community. So crofting doesn't happen, and crofting communities doesn't happen in isolation. Crofting communities are part of our wider community. And at the moment, those who can report are really those who have got a direct connection with the system, either being a tenant, being, if the bill goes through, a subtenant. And going back to Josh's public interest test, the reason that we support crofting is the public benefits it delivers in terms of people. So I feel locally there should be some opportunity for those who are outside the system, who've got a local presence, who care about that community and care about crofting within that community, having some way of doing it. And the only organisation I can think of that could potentially fulfil that role is having some role perhaps for a community council. But it would have to be based on evidence. I think at our previous evidence session, the Commission was speaking very strongly that they need to have evidence to act, and I would totally endorse that. But it's something to be accountable to the non-crofting people of the community. I think there'd be worth some discussion about that.
Thank you. Josh.
I'll respond to Ariane's point in a moment, just to pick up what Sandra was saying, which I think is, I think we would be broadly supportive of. That would be a really interesting and potentially kind of challenging topic to navigate, of how the wider community of geography interacts with any kind of like reporting of breaches. That maybe would be a call for something more mediatory. But absolutely, that is a relationship that can work incredibly well. And you get a lot of democracy and communal working between a crofting community and a community of geography, but it can also be and has sometimes been a slightly more fraught relationship. So having mediatory ways of dealing with that, I think, would be really helpful. And who those powers could be invested in, I mean, it would kind of make sense to be the Commission, but if they're also kind of the regulator, then it becomes a bit more challenging. But I think Sandra is right that there is a wider interest within that area in having a crofting system that works, because when the local crofting community is functioning properly, it has a huge impact on that community of geography, and you will see a much more thriving local area. So having a system in which the local geographic community can feel empowered to be a part of that wider crofting system whilst not having the same rights and duties and obligations, I think would be really important. And that probably would need to be some kind of mediatory function, because I think Ariane's right, a soft touch powers for things like that would be really helpful.
James.
So I think, just briefly, I think in terms of the classes of people who might be able to kind of allege a breach, I think parallel with the land reform bill at the moment will be instructive and potentially helpful. I think in dealing with conflict, there's perhaps really interesting learning that perhaps we can share more on in terms of the role of the Tenant Farming Commissioner at the Land Commission. So the Tenant Farming Commissioner has obviously been in post, both incumbent and previously, for nearly a decade now, and has never actually had to use their full breach process powers through the legislation, precisely because there's a policy approach to taking a mediatory approach, resolving disputes as they arise without having to resolve to some of the harder backstop that is in legislation. So I think if you've got the right backstop in place, there's actually a bigger policy question about how you deal with conflict when it arises, having the right people in post, having the right process in post, that you can deal with some of those issues before they get to a point of needing to get into formal procedures or ultimately, and certainly as it was in the tenant sector, ending up in the land court. So I think just in terms of where you get to with that, there's a big policy development issue there that can do a lot of the heavy lifting in resolving conflict before we start to need to get into legislative backstops.
Jackie.
Yeah, I would agree. The Tenant Farming Commissioner is a good example, although I'm sure if you spoke to Rob Black, he doesn't want any more work, so I don't think he wants to bring crofting into his 2 days a week. But yeah, but I think the important thing to remember about the Tenant Farming Commissioner is that the legislation specifically says that he or she must use their functions in a way that encourages good relations between landlords and tenants. So his role, I'm saying his because the current Commissioner is a he, his role is set in that context of encouraging good relations. So his primary function isn't to regulate and enforce. And I think that he has those powers if he needs to use them. But I think that is a very helpful thing. So I'm not sure how that sits with the Crofting Commission, whose primary role is to regulate. So it may need to be, maybe we need another Land Commissioner, James.
Rihanna.
Yeah, I think actually all my points have kind of been covered now. I definitely agree with the link to the Tenant Farming Commissioner. And I think supporting crofters to sit down and resolve issues in a way where that is a bit more open is definitely positive.
Thank you. Donna.
Yeah, I was just sort of listening to the discussion there and, you know, about the WHO report and how do we manage this. And I just wanted to kind of take a throwback to things that used to happen that over the years have stopped. And I guess it leads us maybe to partly why we are where we're at today. So, I mean, a few years ago, I mean, when I say a few years, I'm probably talking a couple of decades or so ago, the Commission used to have staff that went out and their job was to go out and survey townships and have a look at what was happening on the ground and then feed that back into the Commission. That all stopped. They had assessors who were out in the ground and they were volunteer roles, and that was a complicated thing, and there are many reasons why the assessors aren't doing that job anymore. But the point was there was many more eyes on the ground who were able to feed back a view of what was happening in their area. We've still got the commissioners themselves who are in their area, and I'm not sure how much of their time is spent doing that, actually feeding information in. So there were tools that the Commission had in the past that have stopped for various reasons and resourcing issues and whatever else. But they did a good job, I guess, because then you've got a neutral person coming in and actually looking at what's happening on the ground and then finding out some information, then going back. Kind of the job that they were asking the grazing committees to do with the change that's there at the minute. So, you know, there's lots of stuff that used to happen in the past that maybe we can take some lessons from into this in terms of how we handle that. And then you're not creating that conflict directly between people in the township if you're able to use some of them instead.
Before I bring Josh and Sandra in, is there a role for technology in this? So it's probably unlikely that we're going to get a lot more boots on the ground, as they say. Is there a role for LiDAR or, dare I even say it, the AI to triage, to filter out some of the spurious and vexatious claims? Is that a possibility?
I probably don't know enough about the technology to say, but I mean, you know, you could fly a drone over a township, I guess, couldn't you, as a starter? But
possible.
Yeah.
Josh and then Sandra.
I was going to talk about the Tenant Farming Commission, but just conveniently responding to a point about technology. I think there are some forms of technology that could be useful, but ultimately a lot of these decisions would need to be made through a subjective human lens to understand the wider impact they're having. So I'd be very nervous about assuming that AI could sift through and check spurious cases. And just not to disagree with James, but I would add a word of caution about the Tenant Farming Commissioner having kind of like a similar role. I think Jackie's right that it's kind of doing a different function. You could have a role akin to the Tenant Farming Commissioner that could mediate the relationship between a crofting community and the wider geographic community, or between a crofting community and their landlord. But on the reporting of breaches, I think we need to, having looked at how the system and hearing from people how the system isn't working, I think we need to be beefing up these regulatory functions to actually get that working and get more crofts back into productive use. So I think there's a case for remediation, but I don't want us to lose sight of the importance of reaching for regulation, because we've reached a point where everyone is crying out to be regulated. The Commission needs to be empowered to do more regulation, so just not to lose sight of that.
Donna, briefly, did you want to comment on that? No.
Well, I was just going to say, an education, you know, I think the message needs to be out there, and actually really good regulation will help that. I was going to give an example. Can I give an example of where it really shows an example of where there's something wrong with the system that we currently have? Not the crofting itself, but how how things are happening in the background. So I was aware of an accountant friend of mine who contacted me and said, oh, I've got a crofting question. So she had a client, she was doing the end of year accounts for him. And he said, oh, I've bought a piece of croft land in Skye for a substantial amount of money, so probably 6 figures, but I don't appear to have received title for it. And I had to put down the name of a natural person rather than the company, you know, whatever, to get this croft. Now, what had clearly happened in that case was this chap was trying to offload some profit, bought what he thought was land, what he'd actually bought was a tenancy. Like, where was the education there in that whole process that somebody said, you know, you are buying here a tenancy in a regulated system, you know. So we've got to make all that work too, because that just shouldn't be happening.
Yeah. Absolutely, good example. Sandra.
Yes, Donna's kind of covered my point that I was going to make, but I'll just speak to it very briefly. And it's actually an example that I was involved in 20 years ago in my township, and it wasn't to do with a breach, but there was definite conflict and really significant conflict within our township. So my croft, our Common Grazings, has got a village in the middle of it, and it's a very popular tourism-focused village. And over the years, different people come and go, and the culture of crofting is still really, really strong. But there was lots of representation coming from the non-crofting members of the community about cattle, because it's a cattle-only township, grazing in the village, essentially, and that issue was never going to go away. But as Donna mentioned, this was 20 years ago, and we got significant and hugely helpful support from the Commission, who came out. And a big part of that Commission's person role was to speak to us as crofters, but also to speak to the community about crofting, because education kind of has to go both ways. And it was about saying that we've got crofting rights and we want to exercise our grazing rights responsibly. We want to take into account what the wider community feel, because we all live there as neighbours of mine. And through that process, we've actually got to a position where we're all living pretty much in harmony, even though there's some real significant tensions. And I think having the independence and someone who understands crofting, can communicate both to crofters and both to the wider community, was absolutely instrumental. And I say it was a long time ago, but we couldn't have made that progress. And it was about relationships, it was about people, and it was hugely, hugely beneficial to us at the time.
Yeah, thank you. Rhoda.
This kind of brings me back to the last bill. And prior to the last bill, the Commission used to have the role of crofting development, which was taken off them and passed to High. And it seems to me that the people that Donna was talking about that were out on the ground were not only kind of looking to see what was right and wrong, they were also advising people and working with communities and kind of pointing them in the right direction of how to develop their business and grow their business. And there was an education role as well as a development role. And I know when it was taken away, I thought that's maybe a backward step. And I'm wondering, should that be resurrected for the Commission to do it? Because they're closer then to the crofting communities, and Sandra's here from High, so it would be interesting, given your experience as a crofter and your experience in High, and knowledge of what the Commission used to do. I'm putting you on the spot, and it's maybe not very fair given you're employed by High.
You know, I can maybe just speak briefly. So my example was when the Commission had that role, and it worked really, really well in my experience from one occasion. The crofting development remit that came to High wasn't the remit that the Commission had. It was a different remit. It was basically High were being tasked with supporting communities in crofting areas. It wasn't giving direct crofting support. We didn't have colleagues that were specialists in crofting. So the remit that we had, which we now no longer have, it's kind of gone back to the Commission. We had it for some years. I think, speaking personally, but also speaking from a High perspective, I think the supporting crofting side of things sits better with another body other than High, because we don't really do one-to-one support in terms of we're working with communities as whole communities, and it was a different remit, as I say. So what the Commission were doing was not replicated by what High was doing, and at the moment High hasn't got that responsibility. It's gone back to the Commission, and the Commission does have a developmental team, but it's a very, very small team, and they're doing good work, and a lot of work in terms of looking at supporting crofters and understanding succession planning, which is a key concern. You know, a lot of the average age of a crofter is quite high, and making sure that crofters are making proper provision for what happens to their croft in their will and if they're not able to carry on using the croft. So the Commission are active in this area, but it's perhaps not as maybe on the ground working through different specific, locally specific challenges and issues. But it's not an area that I'm hugely familiar with, so I'll stop there.
Okay. We're bang on time. That's 2 half-an-hour slots. So we're now going to move on to the Crofton Commission Powers, and delighted to have Beatrice next to me today again. So move to questions from Beatrice.
Thanks, Convener. It's good to be back in person. This next theme is around the Crofton Commission Powers in sections 8 to 14, and I know my colleague Emma Harper's got a question around section 10, so I would be interested, though, to start this conversation about the three croft limit in section 8. And the view that it is a somewhat arbitrary figure. I wonder if we could maybe open up the conversation around that. I don't know who would like to go first.
Thank you. Yeah. So whilst we kind of welcome the implementation of a fast-track system, I suppose, for family assignations, when we were carrying out our consultation with our members across the Crofton counties, there was quite a spread of differences of opinion about the 3 croft limit. This was mostly most significant with crofters in Shetland that had concerns around this and its potential to stifle active crofters in those areas just because of the differing patterns of ownership. There were obviously other areas that didn't see this as an issue. So I think it's really important that with this, a flexible, regionally sensitive approach is used to this. And I think as well another option to alleviate that concern could potentially be to widen the scope of the condition to kind of any family member assignation, rather than having that kind of arbitrary figure.
Mm-hmm.
Donna?
Yeah, so it's probably the same. That the 3 crofts maybe feels a bit arbitrary because they do vary so much in size as you go. So some of the things we talked about was whether you could more look at maybe a hectareage threshold or whatever. And I appreciate the 3 croft isn't a hard stop. It's just that it would be looked at in more detail if that 3 croft limit is reached. So there is something, and it comes back to what's the policy. So is the policy to keep as many people as possible in that area, in which case you probably do want to limit how many crofts one individual can sit on, because if they have, you do hear of, there are examples out there of where people have pretty much collected all of the crofts in a township, but that shuts everybody out. And is that what we're trying to deliver? So I understand this is trying to address that. It's probably just about finding the right balance that's workable on the ground. So, even if you looked at hectareages, the size of a croft in the Western Isles on average is significantly smaller than, say, the size of a croft, somewhere else in the country. So a hectareage also feels a little bit arbitrary as well. So that's maybe where regional sort of considerations come in. But I think maybe those are there for the Commission in terms of how it then delivers this, in policy terms. So whether there's something needs to change in the bill or not, I'm not sure. But
thank you, Anne.
Yes, I think similar to what people have said already, we can appreciate why there may be differing views on this, and just the challenges of getting that balance right, where from a policy perspective and looking to support population in rural areas, it's really important that there's a focus on supporting crofters on individual crofts when we're looking at population, but also, looking at what's happening on the ground in terms of land use. What we're seeing is, good practical use in terms of people being able to ensure that the land is being used. So, I think really it's very, very difficult, and it just goes back to the focus needing to be on issues around residency and active use on the croft, perhaps, rather than getting too hung up on people who are using or have access to more than 3 crofts.
Thank you. Jackie.
Assignation, we felt that in some ways the Commission didn't really even need to be involved as much as in a straightforward family assignation. The landlord and the crofter and the assignee should be able to organise it themselves. And I would agree with knowledge of what's happening on the ground is really important. The irony is not lost on me that hectarage is arbitrary in this context, but maybe not in other contexts. But I agree, 3 crofts is an odd one to choose because of the difference in sizes. And also it's what people are doing with them, because you could have 3 crofts that are really well used and productive, and 1 that's not, you know, so adding a croft to the productive chap is probably going to be of better use to the wider community. So yeah, I think there needs to be more flexibility in just a cut of 3 crofts.
Okay. Josh.
Yeah, just to pick up on a few points that have been made. So I suppose we would welcome the Commission having some oversight or ability to have oversight over this process, because the public notice and proper consideration of assignation applications is kind of a key part of crofting regulation. So allowing occupiers and crofters to determine that themselves could have some unintended consequences. We think on balance the position that's been arrived at in the bill is good, but I suppose we need to be wary of this kind of fast-track assignation and some unintended consequences it might have. Broadly agree with what people have been saying about the limit of 3 crofts. It's fairly arbitrary because of how they can vary in size. I suppose there does need to be some kind of consideration of agricultural viability, but more importantly, as Anne was saying, about active use and the person who's taking on the tenancy or the ownership is actually going to be ordinarily resident. I take Jackie's point about the arbitrary nature of hectarage, but I do think that sitting alongside as an alternative, not a replacement for, but an alternative could be helpful, because that does give a sense of agricultural viability if you're basing it on hectarage. So I would support that. These things are always slightly arbitrary, but as we've seen in other pieces of legislation, things have to be decided on.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to the policy, because if the policy is, and the public interest is small-scale form of land tenure, then that can be applied in terms of applying a hectarage, I guess, because if that's the public interest and it's well justified and explained to everyone.
Yeah. Josh?
Yeah, just to agree with Jackie, I think Donna made that point as well, to kind of take a step back and really look at what the policy intent of this provision is, and like what's the purpose of it, because then that does really dictate how many crofts might be appropriate or what hectarage might be appropriate if we step back and look at the outcome, and to be wary of there are some unintended consequences here. So could be some unintended consequences here. So we do need a really clear sense of what the purpose of this is, because it is a slight interference in kind of established practice.
Okay. I got a supplementary from Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. It's kind of on the back of what Beatrice was asking about. Section 10 talks about ownership of owner-occupied crofts, and currently it says there's no explicit restriction on who may own an owner-occupied croft, so it includes natural persons, which are people, and non-natural persons, which might be companies, trusts or partnership. So Section 10 introduces a new legal restriction aimed at limiting ownership of owner-occupied crofts to individuals only. So I'd be interested to hear about your thoughts. I mean, I know the intention behind this change is to ensure that owner-occupied crofts continue to be held by individuals who can then fulfil the occupancy of cultivation, agriculture, production, food production and all of that. So I'd be interested to hear thoughts about this part of the bill.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think a few of us may have similar views on this. So in principle, absolutely agree with the intent behind this. Natural persons rather than legal entities should be the only people who can have owner-occupied crofts. This means that you actually get real people living and working on the land. It should help address the kind of speculation that you could see from private companies that we discussed earlier on. However, it has been raised with us that there are a couple of potentially quite damaging unintended consequences. So we do think there does need to be some kind of flexibility inserted into this. So 2 examples that were raised with us, and I think have been raised with others as well, particularly in relation to woodland crofts and to rural housing. So if you want to build housing on croft land and you want to apply a rural housing burden, you can't have an owner-occupier who is a legal person. You need to have an entity that owns that site. So you need to have a rural housing body. So a rural housing body is by definition not a person, so you need to have a legal entity that owns that land in order for that housing project and the rural housing burden to go ahead. So we do think there needs to be some kind of exemption within this section when there is a rural housing burden attached to a croft to allow for some flexibility. There's also, beyond the kind of croft creation, so that was croft creation with housing on, particularly related to woodland crofts. So there could be situations in which an owner-occupier croft comes up for sale, and it's actually a local community organisation that wants to acquire it to bring it into the wider community use. And again, that will often be to do a housing site and also to put a rural housing burden on it, so the 2 points link together. But again, the community body is not a natural person, it is a legal entity. So again, there's a potential there to restrict community bodies from acquiring croft to actually bring them back into wider community use. So Section 10 would prevent this from happening because the community body couldn't legally acquire the croft. How we get around that without creating a lot of loopholes is a point for discussion. I think on the committee there are some unintended consequences there that I'd want flagged in the stage 1 report, and there does need to probably be scrutiny of the amendments to change that, and we'll probably bring some amendments forward at stage 2 to look at that. So yeah, we just want that nuance to be addressed by committee and played out at stage 2.
Yeah. Well, just before I bring other witnesses in, the Croft Commission did, when it gave its evidence on the 24th of September, did say that amendments would be brought forward at stage 2 to permit community-led or partnership models of croft ownership. So you may want to reflect on what safeguards there might have to be if amendments on that basis are brought forward in your responses. Donna?
Yes, I mean, I think Josh has covered the issue there very eloquently, so I wasn't going to add to that, but I would like to maybe discuss a bit more about the owner-occupier crofter status, if I can, because it's kind of tied, and maybe you end up sort of being able to solve one problem with another. So at the moment, the way that the sort of transfer of owner-occupied crofts work is if I'm an owner-occupier crofter and I sell my croft to Jackie, she immediately becomes an owner-occupier crofter. If I'm a tenant and I assign my croft to Jackie, she has to apply and prove that she's going to be resident, that she's got a plan for the croft, you know, that she knows what she's doing, and any kind of transfer of money or whatever in the sale of that tenancy is kind of held until that process has gone through. The 2010 Act, many of the changes in the 2010 Act were brought in to give parity between tenants and owner-occupier crofters, apart from this one glaring omission where, so owner-occupied crofts just change hands like any other freehold without anybody having to justify anything to anybody. Federation and our members feel quite strongly that that needs to be looked at. Now, whether it's something for this bill or whether it's something for further down the line, I don't know, because it's a big change. But it just feels like, you know, we've got this, and maybe then in that situation you might have, because obviously you can't stop land purchases going through, but you could just have that moment where somebody has to go, oh right, oh I'm buying this land, oh it's a croft, oh I have to have a plan here and know what I'm going to do and be resident, and then apply for that status. And then that might mean that you could have people own the croft but not be the crofter, but then somebody else applies to be the crofter afterwards, or you know, something, I don't know. But we really would like this topic looked at and thought about in some way, because I think when we look at the market now at the minute, because at the minute this thing with the limited companies, there's actually very few crofts, as I understand it, that are owned by companies, and of course nobody wants that. That's not what the intention is. So a change to prevent that would be good. But what we do have is lots of people with owner-occupied crofts who have just bought a nice house in the countryside. You know, so I think that's probably where the bigger issue is, and that's something that we would welcome a discussion on.
So you mentioned whether additional legislation, whether this is the bill to have it in. So, reading between the lines, are you suggesting that potentially bringing forward amendments to allow community-led or partnership models in the absence of some of the safeguards that you've set out is a bit premature, and it should be left for a future bill where the whole thing's looked at in a more holistically rather than just... Well,
it's interesting, isn't it? Because in this bill, there actually is a facility being brought forward in this bill to allow a certain collection of people to apply for owner-occupier crofter status. So there's the mechanism is already sort of partly coming in that. So these are for people who are currently locked in a landlord of a vacant croft status, which is a largely historical thing that happened when people didn't understand that to be the owner-occupier crofter, you need to own the whole croft in its entirety. But what happened at one point in time was people maybe sold off a field and didn't, without dividing, and that they didn't realise at the time the unintended consequence of that is you're no longer the owner-occupier crofter. So in this draft bill, there is a provision being added that would allow those people to apply to then be granted owner-occupier crofter status, and it will largely follow the same process as the assignation type thing, as I understand it, other than the right for people to object has been removed, which we think is wrong. If you're going to apply for crofter status in the same way as tenants do, you should be allowed to object. So that mechanism is partly coming in, which is why it's maybe a good time to have this discussion, because perhaps it's building on that. Yeah.
Okay,
sure.
Jackie.
Yeah, I think I was coming right back to Josh's point about exemptions. I would worry about that potentially being too narrow a list, because there will be all sorts of situations we haven't thought of, and there could even be the landlord, the previous landlord of the croft may even want to buy it back to relet if they have some sort of bigger plan to take other land out. And, you know, there could be bigger plans that, so you wouldn't want that list to be too restrictive, or potentially reserve a delegated power to update that in regulation if it was needed. I think the ScotGov are looking at this. I know within the stakeholder group it's been raised as an issue. So I think we need to see what amendments are brought forward at stage 2, but maybe a regulation making power to keep an eye on this might be useful.
Sandra.
With all the points from Joss and Donna, and just to add to it in terms of Section 10, we'd be really keen that provisions are made in this bill to allow socially driven, and the points that Jackie's made there about enabling non-natural persons to acquire a croft, because we're actually seeing more demand from communities now to actually seek to purchase crofts. So it's not new. I mean, through HIE and the Scottish Land Fund in the early 2000s, we supported the community in Colonsay to buy. It was a tenanted croft, and it was purchased by the sale by nominee provision, so technically it then became an owner-occupied croft, and that was purchasing a large croft with the view of then dividing it to create more crofts. So more crofts were created from one croft, a really positive thing for a very fragile island community. And again, much more recently, within the last year, we've supported that same community to buy a owner-occupied croft. And we're actually seeing quite a bit of demand just now. And communities are seeing, similar to housing, communities have got involved in community-led housing because there's huge challenges, and the access to affordable housing is a huge challenge. And now getting into crofting, if you're not getting it through a family assignation, it's something for most people are having to pay to get into, and communities are really keen to provide affordable pathways into crofting. So I think having socially innovative approaches being allowed for within this bill would be a very positive measure.
Can I just pick up, what would we need to define communities a bit more strictly? Because, you know, as a committee, we've heard evidence of communities, and it has broad definitions in communities, whether that's people who live in a locality or communities who share a certain viewpoint. What's your definition of communities when communities would have the right to buy crofts or whatever? How would you define that?
So the examples that I was referring to is quite a selective, and it's quite a tightly defined community, and it's essentially very similar to communities that could use the community right to buy. So it's a whole community organisation, a geographic organisation that's accountable to the local community. So it comprises members of that local community who are resident. But I think this requires more thinking, because there'll be other organisations that don't fit within that very, very tight definition that could still be looking to do projects or acquisitions that will deliver the same outcome. So I think this is very much looking at the outcome and having something where the owner would then be creating a tenanted opportunity going forward. So I think it requires more thought, but I'm coming at it very much from a community perspective, because that's where we're seeing demand. But it doesn't mean that demand would be restricted. There could be some other organisations that would be also minded to be supporting population through croft affordable routes into crofting.
Okay. Josh?
I'd agree with what Sandra was saying. If we need definitions of community bodies that are structured as legal entities, we have plenty of tight definitions within the Land Reform Act and the current Land Reform Bill. So I think that could be done quite easily. I think it is probably reasonable to spend time thinking through the other legal entities that it might be a useful policy useful policy outcome to have them also named. Probably not on the face of the bill. I don't. Because you kind of tie yourself up in knots a little bit there. But I suppose it's important for the committee to note this as a particular point at stage one, and that there does need to be more scrutiny, and that there are potential loopholes and unintended consequences of setting this too wide, because I think we broadly welcome the policy intent collectively of having them making sure that legal entities can't, but there are some exceptions when they should. So just kind of note that complexity. I just wanted to pick up on what Donna was saying about the policy intent of the 2010 Act. And just to get on record as well that I agree with what Donna was saying, but I'd maybe suggest that this could be the bill to deal with the issue of getting parity between granting owner-occupier status and the tenancy assignation process. We have a crofting bill in front of us. It looks like there are mechanisms that are starting to deal with some of these issues. So potentially be a missed opportunity to not think through how we can achieve that policy intent of the 2010 Act in the legislation we have in front of us.
Thank you. Jackie?
I was just going to add that to take title, you have to be a legal person anyway, so I don't think you would need to list specifically types of, because community bodies could be all sorts of different organisations. I think in the legal panel that you heard from, they talked about somehow splitting who takes the legal title and who becomes the owner-occupier crofter. I don't know whether that might, without actually having to list types of people, might be a better way. I don't know how you achieve that though, but as I say, I think this is under discussion with ScotGov.
Okay. Emma.
Just to come back I'm thinking about the openness, transparency, who owns the croft, who owns the land in Scotland, and Transparency International have done work around like this step-by-step process of basically who has that piece of land. So that's kind of the intention. I'm thinking is that it's a person, not an entity in the Cayman Islands. It's kind of a statement, no a question.
Yeah. I 100% agree that there should be as much transparency as possible. That's what the Land Reform Bill in part is trying to achieve, so I think that's absolutely essential. It's just, so we fundamentally agree with the intent behind what Section 10 is trying to do. We just see some unintended consequences, particularly for house building, and for house building to apply a rural housing burden. That is the particular issue that we're coming across, and I hear what everyone else is saying as well, but that's a particular issue that's been raised with us. And considering, as Sandra raised earlier, the kind of the housing emergency, the rural housing crisis that we're facing, and the role that crofting could play in that, it seems a shame or an issue to not address this potential problem for rural housing burdens, which can be a very effective means of keeping people in local places.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on to our next theme, which is common grazing, and questions from Rhoda.
Yeah, thank you. We know there's issues with common grazings where the grazing share has kind of come adrift from the croft, and the bill tries to deal with that. But I'm wondering whether you think it deals with it properly. Does it need to go further? And then there's the other issue around the use of the common grazings. We've touched on environmental purposes and things, but we haven't really talked about carbon rights and who owns the carbon rights in common grazings. So I'm just keen to get people's views on common grazings. Does the bill do it, or are we kind of needing a lot more amendment? And Donna's smiling.
Donna.
So yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? So we absolutely welcome this move to make sure that shares are not accidentally separated, because that's just been a nonsense and has caused all sorts of issues in the past. But it has prompted a lot of discussion about whether shares should ever be separated from the croft, and you know, again, we've spoken to a lot with our members out and about, and internally with our sort of working group, and I think that the feeling that we're getting and the message that we're getting is that they probably shouldn't. I mean, the whole point of crofting is that you have your small in-buy croft, and then you have a share in the grazings, and that allows you to, work with your animals and do all that sort of stuff. There are nowadays more and more crofts that are coming without a share because, obviously tenanted crofts are aside, but owned crofts where people are buying an owner-occupied croft and then discovering that there's no share with it. So they're stuck then with just the in-buy land. And that immediately limits what they can do if they want to look at livestock and everything else. And then we've got the whole growing market of speculation and carbon credits, and who knows where that's going to go, because I don't think we have any definitive real answers on that yet and how that impacts on common grazings and all the rest of it. So really, if we think about what crofting was traditionally, that you needed the share to make the croft viable. The provisions now as they stand means that you can't accidentally separate the share, but it is still giving you the option to choose to separate the share. And I think we don't think you should be allowed to do that. We think the shares should stay with the croft and retain that. Otherwise, we will see, as speculation about all these sort of environmental things and the credits and everything else takes off, we will see people choose to hold on to a croft, to hold on to a share, who are not actively crofting. And we need to prevent that from happening, and we need to ensure that crofters in the future have those shares available to them in order to make their croft viable and able to function if that's what they want to do.
How can that happen at the moment? Because to have a share in common grazing, do you not have to be a deemed crofter? And there's rules around that. So how can that happen under the current legislation without looking at how this future legislation might, stop the inadvertent splitting? Mm-hmm. But there's obviously deliberate splitting. So why does deemed crofting not, or being a deemed crofter, not stop that?
Because a deemed croft is just a legal term for a share that's sitting on its own. It's not really about the crofting. It's there was a land court judgment that looked at all this when it became apparent that this was happening, and so what you got was maybe I was a tenant crofter. I exercised my right to buy. You can't own the share, so that's at the point that it becomes separated. So the share then stays in tenancy and becomes a deemed croft, but it's not a croft, it's a grazing share, and the own croft. Now, when I'm still sitting with both of them, that's fine because I still carry on acting like I would normally. But what happened then was I might have chosen to sell my croft on, and the share was forgotten about or whatever. So then I'm still the tenant of the share, but the croft is with somebody else. Now, I still might be living in the area, so I'm resident. You could argue I'm not using the share, though, and that brings a whole other thing in about whether people should be able to retain shares if they're not using them. But legally, I can have that share and not have the croft, and then that share has to be assigned through the assignation process of tenancy. So it's then legally operating as a separate thing, and I think that's where we have the issue.
I'll come back to that. I've got lots more questions, but I'm very aware that there's other members and
can I just
certainly go on.
I'm just given that diversification and things, and people are coming away from their maybe growing veg or whatever, they're coming away from having animals and not using their common grazing share. Is there an issue there as well?
Yes, is the short answer. Yeah, I mean, I do think we need to look at grazing shares in the round. Again, it's another sort of aspect that obviously land use is changing. Yeah, everything's moving along. So we need to be clear, I guess, about what is the intention and the policy here with grazing shares. I think they're for active crofters, and we don't think you should be able to sit on a share if you're not actively crofting in some way, which is a situation that you could have at the moment. I think the Commission could look at duties action against somebody who's not actively using a share or active. Are they resident? Are they there? We're aware of people who are holding shares that are not resident. The shares were accumulated, I think, because of this problem with the owner-occupied and the deemed crofts. So I'm aware, I think it's on Jura, where there's somebody who's holding about 6 shares, and there are other crofts in that township that don't have a share, that are actively crofting, that would like those shares, but they can't, at the minute, they can't get hold of them, because that person is sitting on them, and it's going to be a long, complicated process for the Commission to prize us out. But effectively, they're now sort of sitting as one croft, you know, that one deemed croft. So there's no land; it's just the shares. So that there's a big problem brewing here that I think we need to get a grip of and be clear on what the intention is around what shares should be for, who should keep them, and how legally they work. I know that the lawyers, when they were in, had a big discussion about what then the legal status of a share is, but I'll leave that to them. But I think it's a topic that we need to sort out.
But just for clarity, is there no duties related to deemed crofts? Because if there is, surely the legislation is already there to deal with those potentially absent or not active deemed crofters on their grazing share. Is there no duties?
I think the only one that's easy to enforce is maybe, well, residency. I don't know. Sorry. Yeah. I think it's... But certainly the Commission would never have yet considered taking that action against somebody for a share, I don't think.
Yeah. Jackie.
Yeah, I think this whole issue, you're right, is common grazings are what, 2/3 of croftland. Half of them don't have committees or unregulated, and it's going to be, you know, a big issue. The term deemed croft is really unfortunate. Crispin Agnew didn't get many things wrong, but I think that was he coined that phrase, and I think it's been not that helpful because they're not tenancies. As, you know, Donna has described it really well. Our view is the same, that these shares should not get detached from crofts. We would agree that there shouldn't be the option even to detach them, or if there is, that they should be then immediately assigned to an active crofter. Part of the problem now with the prospect of carbon sequestration projects and common grazings, you know, delivering many more benefits sort of in the public interest, some of our members have come across the problem of not knowing who owns or who holds all the shares in the common grazing, so that it's almost impossible to get people together to develop. And now we have the potential for joint ventures, which we think is a really good thing, but that involves knowing who has the shares and the transparency. So if they're attached to a croft, that makes that process easier. I don't think there's probably nothing we can do about the ones that have already become separated, other than that at the point they are to be transferred by someone, maybe then they need to be reattached to a croft, an active croft. But it is a massive issue.
There's nothing can be done.
Well,
if there's legislation that forces those shares back together, because they should...
It comes down to the public interest. I have a difficulty with government legislation forcing people to give up their property rights. That doesn't sit easy with me. But if the public interest is that is to be done and it can be justified and there's adequate compensation, then I guess that can be done in legislation. But I think the bill is definitely going in the right direction. And this is a subject, there's a subgroup of lawyers, and that's a very interesting room to sit in, a group of crofting lawyers, that we are talking about this issue. And I'm confident that the bill team in ScotGov are going to come up with something to amend this that will hopefully work.
Okay. I've got Anne and then Rihanna.
Thank you very much. So similarly, we're disappointed that the proposals don't firmly end the creation of deemed crofts and promote the reattachment of shares to the original parent croft. This was very much viewed by the Coral as a priority based on feedback from local crofters, and it's one of the key areas that we would hope could be looked at in a bit more detail. People have spoken about some of the practical implications of that. We've got crofters active in an area who can't acquire shares and utilise local common grazing committees that aren't able to function. Also, perhaps a risk that, there is a situation where grazing shares are being held by people who aren't crofting or resident in the area, and there is potential risk of speculation as well, particularly due to increased potential that common grazing land has for energy development and so on. So I think this is probably the key issue that we would like to highlight at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Rihanna.
I think I would agree with everything that everyone's said, particularly Donna and Jackie, in terms of, you know, we don't support separating the shares from the parent croft. I think it's really important that they stay tied to the croft wherever possible, and they are integral to active crofting. I think in terms of the carbon rights and all of that, I don't think I know enough about that. I don't think in general we know enough about those rights and the credits, but I do think that's something that is really important that we look at further. I think, you know, we have a lot of crofters kind of saying, you know, my landlord is wanting to do a carbon credit activity on our common grazing, and we don't really know where we stand. So I think trying to clarify that as much as possible would be really useful.
Thank you. Josh.
Great, thanks. I'm just going to speak to section 15 on the unattached grazing sheds, not speak to section 18 on common grazing, use of common grazing for forestry and environmental purposes, just because I don't want to go on for too long. And the discussion has been really helpful. I'm not going to try and add to any of that, and thanks to Donna for kind of explaining more of the complexity. I just want to make some high-level kind of policy points about these unattached grazing shares. So, I mean, our view is that the grazing shares should always reside with the croft. It's a matter of principle. There's been research by the Crofting Commission and UHI, University of Highlands and Islands, that show common grazings are the economic and cultural heart of crofting, and that really needs to be recognised. And I agree very much with what Anne was saying, that we should be finding a way to end decrofting and reattach grazing shares whenever possible. If we don't do this, there is a risk that we get further fragmentation, and that will have a really negative impact on the crofting townships and the common grazings. The common grazings and their relationship to the township are the kind of bedrock of crofting. It's where the cooperation, the structures, the development of community happens. And I think we need to be very careful of these unattached grazing shares, particularly when we discuss Section 18 later, and the potential for speculation. And I suppose there needs to be a point made here on the record about the fact that grazing shares shouldn't be seen as having kind of profit-generating potential. They're an integral part of the crofting system. They're not an asset to be traded or speculated upon. They're the kind of foundation of making a township viable. And I know Sandra's got examples of you know, how they can be used for the common good, for the collective public benefit in terms of developing housing and things like that. And if we think about the environmental and kind of natural capital interventions that could and should be happening on common grazings, they will be more effective when they're done collaboratively, across the whole with grazings committees, rather than being done in a kind of individualistic patchwork. So I think there's so many strong policy reasons why unattached grazing shares should be reattached, and we should end that system for environmental, kind of community and agricultural reasons.
I'm just going to comment on, so we had Andrew Thin on the 24th of September. He suggests that it's not logical not to allow shares in common grazing to be split, because, in his words, the common land has productive uses that may not necessarily be only about grazing, and it could be used for the benefit of the country. So Andrew Thin suggests that in some circumstances, the best way to drive productive use of common grazings could be through shareholders being allowed to acquire shares that are disconnected from crofting land. That sounds like speculation to me. And we did hear examples of common grazing groups setting up hydro schemes and whatever, and being a bit tetchy about the fact that there were some people who they were non-resident, the other side of the world, were benefiting from the work that the Common Grazing Group had done to attract funding and whatever, and manage a hydro asset, and some of that money was actually leaving the community altogether. So, Josh, I'm going to come back to you, and then Donna. There's a conflict here, or Jackie. Everybody. So it does sound like we're all being very much in agreement, but this sounds like a very contentious issue, because with carbon credits, as someone has touched on, the potential forestry and renewables, you know, the return on that in the future. This is could be a real tipping point when it comes to the whole idea of crofting and sustainability, individual in-buy land without the common grazing. Jackie.
Andrew Thin sometimes chucks in grenades just to see what happens, and that's maybe one of them. And it does come down to the bigger picture of what crofting is about. And I think it's not for me to say necessarily, but my understanding is it's about communal endeavour and shared benefit. And common grazings, yes, they are going to evolve in how they're used, but I think the principle, if that is the policy, is that shared benefit and endeavour is shared with, between the people who have the interest in the land. And I think there's always going to be, in the joint venture proposals in the bill, I think that is a potentially really positive thing because, as Josh said, and I think coming from a landowner point of view, we would like to see the landowner and the crofting community in the area and the shares and the common grazings working together towards these wider public. Yes, we can deliver things in the wider public interest, but the shared benefit should stay within the people that have the interest in the land, I think, and that would be the crofters and the landowner. There may be, I can see conflict between the non-crofting community and the crofting community if the non-crofting community can see benefit, but where there's benefit, there's generally risk. So I think the carbon credits issue we do need clarification on that, and there will be all sorts of agreements coming to pass at the moment. But the benefit follows risk as well. So I think there are bigger issues there. But yeah, I think the idea of speculation in croft shares, someone buying up lots of croft shares to then develop a project. Again, they'll probably need landowner input anyway, but that to me spells disaster for a lot of these areas. But again, it comes down to what your vision of crofting is.
Josh.
Yeah, I would take issue with the sentence that you described from Andrew, and I would agree with what Jackie was saying, because I think Andrew's conflating land use change with the unattached grazing system. And actually, this is about saying what Jackie was saying, that we have a communal system that can deliver common benefit and be very collaborative. We need to make sure it works with the changing land use pressures that we have and some of the things that need to happen. But that doesn't mean you insert speculation, disconnection between the township and the common grazings, and further potentially increase the marketisation of crofting, which I think a number of us are very much against. So I think it's a bit of a blind alley, that argument. We have a really resilient system that we need to strengthen and think, how can we make this system deliver the land use change that we need, not break up that system and think that actually if we insert individualistic profit-generating mechanisms, that's somehow going to deliver the land use change that we need. Because these common grazings have a huge potential to deliver big landscape scale change and deliver communal benefit. So I think we need to find ways of making that working rather than finding ways to tear it down.
Yeah, thank you. Donna.
Well, yeah. So Jackie and Josh, I think of some of that. I think Andrew's barking up the wrong tree with that statement, and I don't think a lot of folk would go with him on it. And I think it is about encouraging what we can already make good use of. And at the minute, there is a will out there to do environmental projects and things like that on common grazings. There are other barriers that stop those happening, which are largely around finance and risk and stuff like that. So, we could address those and make it easier for the people who are already there to do that alongside their other crofting activities. So we've got an agricultural support bill going through. There could be mechanisms put in there that make it easier. Common grazings is still not, I know that's for another day, but common grazings and how those are used and supported through the new agricultural policy are not being talked about enough, but it's crucial to this side of the picture too. So when we look at the environmental use of common grazings, it's great, again, that that's being added, but we need to make sure that the right support mechanisms and stuff then are there to enable people to do it, because at the moment there is a will, but it's not happening for other reasons. So to say, it's got to be part of that. Crofting fundamentally was put or crofting law, regulation, if you like, was put in place for a few things. So to keep people in the place, to keep them active on the land, and for fair rents and all that sort of stuff. If we start to tinker with this and split up that system, then, that's a disaster waiting to happen.
A couple of times in this session, Donna, you've said, it's maybe not for this bill, but it sounds like there's potentially a lot of unintended consequences. And if I was someone managing someone's tax affairs, and you talked about somebody needing to offload 100 grand a profit, and look, see how they could do that. If I'm a tax advisor sitting here, I'm looking at this session going, right, okay, we've got this bill coming in here. They're not going to make changes, but they're probably going to do that in the next 5 years. I'm going to go out there and find out. I'm going to send a leaflet to all the crofters and say, I will buy your grazing shares because I think there's an investable, there's the risk on it's worth taking. And we sit down here in 5 years' time and we go, do you know what, the horse is bolted? Because we've got a whole lot of absentee owners of grazing shares that we're just not going to get back without fighting through the courts. So whilst you say this is maybe not the place, does this bill need to go further? And this is a question I was going to ask it right at the very, very end. Does this bill need to actually go further than it does at the moment to address some of these loopholes, put the safeguards in place now, rather than highlighting them and allowing those loopholes to be exploited over the next 4 or 5 years until the new Crofton bill's put in place?
So you could probably easily change, like stop any more deemed crofts being created. Like, you know, so the wording in the draft bill is except insofar as the conveyance expressly provides. Take that bit out.
Yeah. Okay.
And then you've got the acquisition of the croft land includes, as a pertinent, the grazing rights. So that immediately stops more deemed crofts being created. You know, so there probably is stuff that could be done here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Josh, did you want to come back in?
Yeah, so I was going to come in about Section 18 to talk about environmental use, but I could make a brief comment about the point you made. I don't know if Jackie wants to come in on that. I mean, whenever we have a piece of legislation in front of us, I don't think we should be talking too much about things for the next bill, because Lord knows when the next bill's going to come. So if we know there are issues or unintended consequences and it's within the scope of the bill and would be, you know, make legislative sense, we should absolutely deal with it now. And I think when we get to section, was it theme 6, it'll be good to talk through some of those. I think there are probably some proposals that are not within the scope of the bill or would not be appropriate for now, but other points that I think we've raised so far that absolutely should be dealt with by the bill.
Yeah. I'm going to bring Jackie briefly just to comment what's just gone before, then I'm going to bring Emma Roddick in on a question that pertains to this part of the bill as well.
Yeah, I think in terms of dealing with the existing deemed crofts and stopping those being bought up by speculators, this bill could deal, it would be in scope of this bill, but it's whether or not there's been sufficient public consultation and whether the justification for doing that has been built in the evidence base for it. So I think that's a question for Scott Gov and for the CABSEC to decide. I guess if there wasn't huge opposition to it, then, or if most stakeholders were in agreement, then it could happen. But it's whether that kind of background work has all been done in sufficient detail.
Okay. Emma Roddick.
Thanks, Convener. Just thinking about environmental use and potential profits, kind of the example of carbon credits, in the absence of, you know, immediate clarity on who is the owner and going to benefit from any income related to that kind of use of common grazings. Is there any practical safeguard that could be introduced in a shorter term, maybe enforcement from the Crofting Commission that would ensure that financial benefit is retained by or at least shared with the crofter shareholder community?
Donna, you kind of touched on safeguards.
Yeah. So, carbon credits are. Yeah, we need to really bottom out what happens with carbon credits. You know, who owns them? Is it the landowner? Is it the crofter? I mean, grazing committees are probably not structured, for instance, to hold carbon credits, and you know, so there's a whole mess here that we really need the government to kind of step in, I think, and give a clear guidance and framework on, because I think potentially at the minute we're at the stage where people maybe want to do stuff, but you know, so for instance, at the minute the landowner can veto some of the projects that crofters might want to do, and if you're a landlord, you might say, well, yeah, I'm just going to sort of sit in it for a while and see what happens. You know, we need some clear guidance on what the intention is here and how it will work. But even that aside, so say that you had an equal share or however you work it going forward, for crofters it's still a massive risk, and I think we need to understand about, you know, financially, if they're taking on, say, the burden of doing some work and putting some capital in, because there are grant funds out there, but they don't cover everything. It's a massive risk, and then you're potentially tying other grazing shareholders into something for 100 years, but you have no idea. Those shareholders don't come along. You know, so there's loads of complications around this. I don't have any of the answers or suggestions really on this, Emma. It's a really tricky area, but I think we need to bottom it out and come up with a sensible way forward.
Yep. Jackie and then Josh.
I mean, I think there could be cases where a landlord may have reasons to not want something to happen. We have other examples where our members are saying to us, we want to do something on the common grazings, and that would be shared benefit with the shareholders, but they have difficulty, again, getting everyone. People have different views on these projects, and some people are still very nervous about them and don't want to get involved. So there is a big issue there about how to facilitate projects to happen, if that's what is the wider benefit to be delivered, where you have a number of people who don't always have the same point of view, or we can't get in touch, we don't know who some people are, so that's an issue.
Yeah. Josh?
Yeah, just to pick up a point from the previous discussion about unattached grazing shares and kind of a lack of transparency, understanding who has rights to the common grazings. If we start to deal with some of those issues and make that clearer, it will make some of these processes in terms of land use change on common grazings more straightforward. I suppose just to flag, there's obviously a vast amount of peatland that needs to be restored is under the crofting system, so there's a huge opportunity here as well. And we have seen, speaking about our own members, you know, community landowners working with crofting communities to restore peatland. There is maybe some nervousness around monetising that and turning it into carbon credits, but what we should be interested in as the public and as the government is the peatland restoration happening, not is it being monetised. If it is being monetised, then how those benefits are being shared is really important. But the key thing from a public interest point of view is that the peatland restoration is happening. And there are grant mechanisms for that. You know, there is funding coming through big transmission upgrade funds and things like that. So the really important thing is to make sure that those projects can happen on the ground. I think there is a huge lack of clarity about carbon rights on crofting land. There is work that needs to be done by academics that is being done. There is a need for a steer from government, and the Crofting Commission probably has a role to play in that. There is also, you know, there's a lot of work happening on the ground, which I think would be good for the committee to be cited to. There's a number of Ferns projects run by Nature Scott that are looking at this. The Arnold project, which is in Barvas. Then you've got the Flow Country Partnership that's doing work on this as well. Peatland Action have lots of examples of how this is working on common grazings. The thing that hasn't been bottomed out is the split of any benefits and risks and responsibilities and insurance and all of these kind of things. And so what we need is some working models. I mean, we have a natural capital community partnership team that are looking at examples of how this could work. We know there are other people looking at this, so I think it would be good for the committee to recognise that this is an active point of discussion, and we do need to get some working models on the ground. And also just to get on record that I think we should be quite nervous about any attempt, if a common grazing is deemed to be abandoned, for crofting landlords to step in and kind of do the work and claim the benefits. That would be quite a kind of a dangerous watering down of a lot of the rights that we've been talking about. You know, common grazings operate on this mutual system of cooperation and shared work, and that's the approach that we need to be taking with any kind of peatland restoration or tree planting that needs to happen. But yeah, we need some models on the ground that actually work, and there are some things coming, but we probably need, the government has a role in encouraging that to happen at a quicker pace.
James?
We have a similar issue just from the tenant farming side in terms of kind of environmental and carbon projects on agricultural holdings as well. So again, I think clarity over what we mean by carbon rights would be really helpful, not just for the crofting situation, but actually in other circumstances and other forms of tenure across the country. I think there's also something to think about in how carbon credits are created. They are not a natural product. You don't grow them out of the ground. You know, there's a verification process to go through. So as part of that verification process, what's built around that, how can you perhaps tweak that to ensure that there are other things that are taken into consideration? So perhaps, you know, the tenure system that is being used to generate those credits, and making sure that things like, risks and benefits and opportunities are being more fairly shared. So there's also that kind of bigger question. I would point to some work that Professor Jill Robbie from the University of Glasgow has done for the Commission in previous years, looking at different ways of generating carbon credits or administering carbon that is perhaps more holistic and shares the benefits and opportunities and risks more widely across different players in Scotland's land use.
Okay. Emma Roddick's got a supplementary. I'll bring Jackie in first just to...
Yeah, I was just coming back to Josh's point. If common grazings are abandoned, there is an issue there about abandoned grazings, and if there's a party wanting to do a project that will deliver wider public benefit, we need to find a way of doing that. And if the public interest is that the benefit shouldn't follow the risk and go to the land, go back to the landowner, then there needs to be, we do need to have some sort of a structure. Because if the grazing's abandoned, then there aren't active crofters there. So it's who does that? I think landowners in crofting areas completely get the principle of sharing benefit and sharing risk. I think that is completely accepted. But we do need to have some structure so that these projects happen, so that they don't just not happen because there's no structure there to enable it.
Thank you. Emma Roddick.
Thank you. I just want to go back briefly to Donna, because you've described the landowner's right to refuse consent as too broad and ambiguous. And a couple of times there you said the carbon credits situation needs to be bottomed out. So I wonder, based on your experience, are landowners already using that uncertainty around carbon rights as a kind of barrier to prevent grazing committees from initiating environmental projects, and if so, what's that looking like, and how does it impact the community's ability to attract financing for schemes?
I don't know if I have any examples of where that's already happening. There are examples of where landlords have refused permission for crofters to do woodland in the past. So I guess that the principle, and that was probably prior to all the speculation about carbon credits. And some of that's maybe about, I guess you could work together to do that. Now, the Commission has a role there, I believe, in that, all these applications go through the Commission, and the landlord does have to have, sensible reasons to say no. So that there's a role for the Commission, I guess, to view those and step in. So I think we're just kind of based on the fact that there has been issues in the past. You can see that with the uncertainty over how this all works and hangs together, and I'm not. Don't get me wrong, I'm not labelling all crofting landlords as out to do this, because there are some very good crofting landlords. I know them who are absolutely, as Jackie says, they want to work with their community and make it happen. But even with that, you need to understand fully how that happens, so that everyone can get the best benefit out of it and achieve the most that they can. But I am also aware, let's face it, of landlords who have absolutely no interest in crofting, sometimes don't even understand that they've bought a crofting estate and what that means. And you could absolutely see in those cases that suddenly they find themselves being able to just say, oh, well, no, I'm not doing that because I've bought this land and I want to benefit. So it's about safeguarding really against those people rather than just generally labelling it as an issue. But I don't know if that helps, Emma, but it's a tricky area.
Josh?
I agree with Donna's points about the landowner's right of refusal of consent is a bit too wide now to interpretation. I think Donna's covered that off well. And I also agree that not all crofting landlords understand the system the same way, and not all of them are present in the same way. There are absentee crofting landlords who do not understand the system. And in terms of impacts on local communities, and related to the carbon markets, I suppose the most dramatic one, Emma, is in terms of the difference over the past 5 years between how a crofting estate has been valued. If the owner is saying that there is a kind of speculative value from particularly peatland restoration on the common grazings, we have one prospective community landowner who's come up against the challenge of a valuation which is now vastly higher than it was, because there is deemed to be what I would see as an unrealistic value in the peatlands on the estate. So there is something around there about being, and this is a wider point, I think, for government legislation and the discourse around carbon markets, and being realistic about the opportunities and the risks and the financial rewards that happen within these. Like these are land use changes that need to happen, but let's not over-egg the pudding about how much we think we're going to be making off this, because it does have a tangible impact upon the resilience and viability of local communities. And just on the point of kind of picking up what Don was saying about some kind of guardrails, so subsection 50ZA3, where it provides no role for the Commission where a landowner grants unconditional consent. This just seems slightly odd and seems at odd with other situations where the Commission is responsible for determining applications. We're not entirely sure why it's in there. You know, that could just be a case of in line 21 changing must to may, so that it's not quite so deterministic and then allows scope for that. Just because, I mean, that's an open thing. We don't particularly understand why that is the case, and so we would welcome scrutiny on that and possibly changing a must to a may.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on to our final questions from Ariane Burgess.
The theme that I'm going to be asking around is part 2, merger of the Scottish Land Court and the Lands Tribunal for Scotland. And I see from the papers that most people are content with this idea of streamlining and efficiencies. So happy for people to come in and say more about that if they want to, but I have a particular interest, which is, and I'm going to direct my question to Josh in the first place, is around the potential of, as you've said in your written submission, extending the jurisdiction of the Land Court to cover environmental rights, including litigation concerning contraventions of environmental laws, statutory and common law, nuisance and planning matters. So if you could just expand on that whole part around the opportunity we've got here for the potential of an environmental court in Scotland.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, we definitely support the principles of the merger, and we definitely support some of the proposals that we know will be coming in at stage 2 that would facilitate access to justice for less affluent parties. And I suppose this is coming from a Community Land Scotland perspective, but it also comes from stakeholders who've asked us to make representations on this. So this is the Environmental Rights Centre for Scotland and Scottish Environment Link as well. So in the policy memorandum on page 44, there is explicit mention of the fact that the Land Court could take on new functions in relation to the Aarhus Convention. And as Ariane was saying, so we think there's an opportunity here in this merger to allow the Scottish Land Court to have jurisdiction over environmental rights. And I suppose this is following up on a long call from environmental organisations to have a dedicated environmental court or tribunal. It would increase access to justice, address fragmented routes to remedy and develop judicial expertise. Essentially, it could be a one-stop stop for land and environment cases and also improve administrative efficiency for the judicial system. So that means people could bring land cases and environmental cases, and often the two are intertwined. So it makes good sense and builds on long-standing commitments under the Aarhus Convention. And to our mind, to not at least recognise this at stage 1, get it on the report and consider it further at stage 2 would be a missed opportunity. And I know there are a number of possible amendments that will be coming in from the Environmental Rights Centre for Scotland about how this could work. And I think it's very important that it gets flagged at stage 1.
Thanks. Anyone else got any comments on that? Jackie?
The Land Court in Scotland has developed over the years a huge amount of expertise in the areas that it's looking at. We haven't commented on the merger, and if its functions were to be broadened, I mean, you need to take evidence from the Land Court on that, but as long as there was adequate resourcing and to enable it, because I think it's one of the reasons of the streamlining, I think, is to help cope with the workload. So I think as long as that aspect was dealt with and there was enough, I suspect there would need to be a lot more consultation done on that before you would, but again, could be secondary powers could be used to look at that.
Okay. Just a final wrap-up. I touched on it earlier. It's quite clear what the aims of the bill are, and the policy memorandum sets out that it's to strengthen crofting in 7 key aspects. However, multiple stakeholders have suggested that it's not sufficient to cover what is actually needed. Some state that it's taken 8 years and it's done nothing to address what is already a complex web of legislation. And really all it does is minor tweaks. Throughout this session, it would appear that we focused on what's not in the bill rather than what is in the bill. and potential loopholes and unintended consequences. What are your views? Does this bill need to be significantly amended, or do we leave it generally as it is and hope that we can get another crofting bill in the next parliamentary session? Jackie.
I think we've got this bill in front of us now. We've got limited parliamentary time. From our perspective, no matter what your views or policy views on crofting are, the process of this bill has been a really good one, I think. I mean, it started with a list of things from the Law Society that could be fixed, which is, I think, quite a good place to start when you're looking at legislation. So it hasn't really had a really strong political or policy slant to it. It's been fixing things that practitioners thought needed fixed. So, and the process, I mean, we've spent 2 years with monthly stakeholder meetings. The officials have been, I think, really impressive in terms of their openness and their willingness to discuss things and their willingness to say, okay, we got that wrong, so we'll change it. That, you know, that has been a really good process that other teams maybe could look at. So I think we've got this bill. There's, you know, peace has broken out. We're all in agreement with each other pretty much on everything. So let's get this one through. I think it does a bit more than tinkering. You know, there are things in it that are useful that will help. I don't like everything in it, but I think generally there's quite a lot of consensus. So I think we should get this one through. But quite often around the table today, we've been saying, well, it depends what your bigger view of crofting is. It depends what the bigger policy is. And that still does need answered, because it's trying to be all things to all people at the moment, and sometimes difficult decisions might need to be made down the line, and that will take leadership. So we need that leadership from top down for another bill, whereas I think this one has kind of evolved with a lot of co-working in a very good way. The next one might be a bit more controversial, but it will need to be done.
Thank you. Donna.
Yeah, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with Jackie. I guess what we're seeing in the discussions is a reflection of that this bill was initially sort of kicked off, if you like, 8 years ago to address known issues at the time, and it was meant to be a quick fix to do that. For a variety of reasons, it's taken us till now to get here. And I think that what we're seeing is that the discussions just reflect that the world has moved on, and so the things that keep coming out through all the chats are because of that, rather than because there's anything fundamentally wrong with what's in this bill. So I just think it's that there's more desire now to look more fundamentally at crofting. But I mean, we would be supportive of this bill progressing, you know, albeit with some minor tweaks or whatever else. But in principle, it's there to do a job. We should continue to do that job. But we do then. It would be good to get some commitment, if it's at all possible, or even have something in the bill that says, you know, that there is a commitment to then look at and review where crofting is, and as we said, what the policy ambition is, because you know, there are some fundamental things that have changed in time. We've got an escalating market in crofts that's really driving a lot of the activity. That's a problem. We need to look at how we address that problem. You know, there's all sorts of other things. Right to buy, is that a good thing? Is that not a good thing? It's caused a lot of issues. Creation of new crofts on public land. You know, there's a lot of big ticket items that we could now look at. That's just because the world has changed. So I think most of us would like to see the bill, or maybe all of us would like to see the bill progress. But a real commitment to then immediately say, right, well, what's next and where do we go? And yeah, start with what's the policy, take it from there.
Thank you. Rihanna.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that Jackie and Donna have just said. I think, you know, just to highlight as well, the engagement with the bill team and the crofting bill group has been really positive, and I think that was a really useful step to do, to kind of go through all of those legislative changes prior to a bill being introduced. Obviously, the bill is introducing a lot of technical clarifications to legislation, as we've discussed, and I think whilst it maybe doesn't make as many material changes for crofters that we would like to see, I think, as kind of Donna touched on and as we've discussed today, there's a lot of things that can be amended that would start to make those material changes.
Josh.
Yep, I agree with a lot of what's been said. I think the kind of the principles of the principle of the bill can definitely be supported. From our perspective, I think there are some amendments at stage 2 that could do more than technical tweaks, add some real change. You know, we're wanting to see more Evidence required to satisfy residency duties. We do want to extend the Commission's scrutiny to the award of owner-occupier status, so align it with the assignation of tenancies. We'd like to explore things like granting rights to exclusive benefits from any crofter-led environmental initiatives on common grazings. There could be more speedy and stringent procedures for breach of duties. And then I think it's also important to get on record that there's broad consensus around this bill, and I echo what Jackie's been saying in terms of the process. I think has been commendable, and it's not often that we get this much agreement amongst this group of stakeholders. So I think that's something to be celebrated. But there is going to be a need for kind of what I would call structural reform of crofting in the next Parliament. So getting that on the record and getting whatever commitments we can from government that there will be structural reform, and that will pick up on the things that Donna has been mentioning, and that's things like how we address the escalating market in croft tenancies, limiting crofts or areas, limiting crofts that one individual can potentially occupy, doing something around restricting individual right to buy, and this is all around the kind of like marketisation of crofting that I think we want to push back on. Definitely welcome creation of new crofts and exploring the expansion of the crofting model around Scotland. We shouldn't put the cart before the horse, but we could definitely explore that. I suppose, in terms of closing remarks, we have a really resilient, potentially democratic, collaborative model in crofting that could do a lot in terms of land use change. It could do a lot for getting more people living and working on the land and addressing rural depopulation and doing a lot of the policy outcomes that the government talks about and certainly lots of us want. So I think, a bit more than just tweaking in this bill, we should definitely support it, but then we do need to be looking at how do we build a really resilient crofting model for the 21st century through a much more structural piece of reform in the future.
Thank you. Sandra.
Our response to this bill was really short because we pretty much endorse everything that's in it, and also wish to just pass on our thanks to the bill team. They have been exceptionally open and inclusive, and I think that's why we've got to such a positive outcome is largely due to that. Interestingly, some of the sort of more policy-driven elements of the bill were dropped, and I think when the consultation was happening, that's where there was quite a more divergent opinion of views. And there is more work to be done looking at the policy side of things, but I feel quite strongly that getting the technical fixes done gives a really solid foundation to make the more involved policy discussions more fruitful, because we won't be getting hung up about things to do with Dean Crofts and the really technical matters. So I think this is a big step forward, a very positive step forward, but it's not the end result, end of the journey yet.
Anne.
Yes, thank you. So obviously there are things included within the bill that will be beneficial to existing crofters in terms of streamlining processes and so on, but there is a great deal of disappointment that the bill doesn't go far enough, and I think we would want to see, as others have expressed, a commitment to more fundamental change in terms of how the system works, and really trying to tackle some of the significant issues that are preventing people to become crofters, and really just impacting on population in our more remote communities. So yes, the bill, I think as it stands, is fine. Obviously we've spoken about some of the issues that could still be looked at, but we are disappointed and would like to see a commitment to more fundamental change.
James.
Largely agree with what everyone else has said. I think, given the timing that's left in this session and where we are, this works as a technical fix that deals with some of those issues. But there is a need to have a longer, deeper look at crofting as a whole, but also link that with other areas of work. So, for example, just small landholdings legislation is being updated in the Land Reform Bill at the moment, which is the crofting out with the crofting counties. So building these types of links again to planning. I mean, we have a kind of case at the moment with a landowner who's trying to create new crofts. Brilliant, great idea. They're struggling with the planning authority because of they're creating rural housing. So again, there's these kind of bigger questions, links that could be explored at a later date. But I think for now, the bill as it is deals with some of the issues. It provides, I think, that foundation that was mentioned a minute ago, and there is space in the next session to have kind of bigger discussions about crofting, as there probably has been for decades and centuries and will be to come.
Thank you very much. That concludes our questions. I normally say you'd be pleased to hear, but I think everybody's quite enjoyed their contributions today, and certainly I'm sure all the members of the committee have very much appreciated your input and the evidence you've given us. So that concludes the evidence this morning. I'm now going to suspend the meeting until for 5 minutes to allow witnesses to leave the room. I suspend the meeting. Welcome back. Our next item of business today is consideration of a negative instrument, the Rural Support Simplification and Improvement Data Publication Scotland Regulation 2025. Do any members wish to make any comment on the instrument? Ariane.
Broader concern that's been raised to me by constituents that there's a sense that this is a bit of tinkering around the edges of existing schemes rather than delivering that transformational scheme, transformational change that was promised in the vision for agriculture, and that these changes, so that the government failed to deliver its initial plan of a menu of measures on the agriculture reform list of measures for Tier 2, and stakeholders have raised with me that the changes are very poor alternative and are raising questions on the government's ability to actually deliver the better outcomes for nature and climate through these stronger conditionalities. So just wanted to put that in the record, that people are raising concerns that we're not actually getting to that space of the agricultural vision.
I don't believe that's pertinent to this negative instrument, and any further instruments will be coming forward, but it's not in direct relation to this, which is, in effect, a very small amendment to the way data is published. Any other comments? No. I'll assume everybody is content. So that concludes our proceedings in public, and we'll now move into private sessions, and I suspend the meeting.